Hello, go into any business school anywhere in the world and say the word strategy, and moments later you'll hear the name Michael Porter, followed by the 5 forces. Staple since Porter published his book Competitive Strategy in 1979. But in fact, a question has arisen. Is Porter's model appropriate for the modern world? We're joined now by Professor Raj Raina, who thinks there may be, well, a question mark. It may be time to change. But before we get on to why, let's just define what Porter's 5 forces is all about.
See, Porter's framework really came about through his work in competitiveness and industrial economics. And the core of the framework, the recommendations were the following. The first recommendations were that in any industry, there are 5 forces: buyer power, supplier power, competitive rivalry, threat of new entrants, threat of substitute products, which together define competitiveness in the industry and the profitability of the industry. So for an industry to be attractive, all the 5 forces had to be weak. That was the first kind of proposition. The second proposition following from the first proposition was that companies should select industries where all these forces are low. And the last proposition was that companies should position in a creative way in these attractive industries so that they can further get a competitive advantage. And the overall recommendation was companies which follow this recipe will attain sustained profits. That was the core of the 5 forces.
And it has been widely followed ever since. It's become almost a gospel of sorts. How appropriate, Raj, is it for the modern business world?
I think even if you look at contemporary world, what has changed in the contemporary world is the speed of change. People tend to think that the contemporary world is the same as the last 2 decades. But in the last 10 years, the speed of change has increased drastically. It's not just the speed of change which has increased drastically. It is also the nature of change. You find the term disruptive change being used quite often, whereby competitors come with products which are 10 times better at practically half the cost. What this has done is it has changed the dynamic in industries in many ways. First of all, it has become very difficult to define industry boundaries. Industry boundaries have become very blurred. Secondly, by the time you're finished with the 5 forces analysis, which if you do properly will take you a fair amount of time, the industry has changed. So it hasn't really given you that kind of advantage it used to give earlier. But there are also other issues, more fundamental issues in Porter's 5 forces, which kind of undermined its usefulness. And these allude to some key assumptions in the framework. The first assumption is the underlying nature of competitiveness. The framework assumes that there is competition not only between rivals, but also between buyers, suppliers, new entrants, threat of new substitutes. But we have seen in many industries that there is a collaborative arrangement between buyers and suppliers and potential, sometimes even collaborative arrangement between rivals. And it can be legislatively arranged or by collusion. So the underlying assumptions of competitiveness do not exist in all industries.
Let me ask you, to come at it from a different angle. Which are the companies then that have really made it big that have adopted Porter's 5 forces? Are there any?
I haven't come across in my personal experience, and if you look at the last 10 years, actually most companies have done the opposite. Even if you go back 20 years ago, Toyota has become a global leader in automotive industry. And one of the reasons it's a global leader is because it redefined its relationship with its suppliers to one of collaboration. If you take another example, more recently, an American company which operates in a very bad industry, which is plastic moldings. It's called Nipro. It's an American company. It makes 3 times more profits than the lousy industry it is in. only because it has a very collaborative relationship with its select customers. Take the case of Southwest Airlines. As per Porter, within Porterian kind of framework, airline industry is a lousy industry to get into. But Southwest Airlines, for the last 35 years, has made tons of money. In fact, a recent study said it has made as much money in airline industry as the rest of the airline industry has lost.
What about someone like Apple Computer?
Again, Apple is a very interesting company, because you remember that Apple Computer changed its name to Apple Incorporated. And when Steve Jobs came back, and you will wonder, why would somebody enter an industry where Sony has 80% of the market share? It goes totally contrary to what Porter preached in his 5 forces, that if there are strong forces, and the strong forces in this case were that Sony was a dominant player, there are large music distribution suppliers who had a lot of bargaining power, and Sony had a brand in the music industry. So you will wonder, why would somebody try to enter such an industry?
So
yet within 2 years, Apple took over the dominant position of Sony and captured 80% of the market.
A number then of telling examples. What is the reason for this dichotomy between, on the one hand, the popularity of Porter's framework and its apparent irrelevance in really building exceptional businesses?
It goes back to some of the context in which the Porter's 5 forces were born. I think the first point which has to be taken into account is that in the 70s, when the framework was published, a lot of American companies were facing serious competition from Japanese. And Porter came at the right time with the framework where a lot of people could anchor the argument that we need to become more competitive, okay? Missing the underlying assumption of the reasons for the success for Japanese companies. The reason for success of Japanese companies wasn't because they were highly competitive. The reason was they had redefined the underlying assumptions, how they operate. The second reason is that the Porter's 5 forces gave a framework to consultants, to teachers who teach in many business schools, to hang the analysis on. While it was good to hang analysis on, but in a real world, if you look at excellence of some of the new companies, they haven't followed Porter's recommendations. Take Google, for example. It broke into the industry where there were other players which were already dominant, and it entered that industry and became a dominant player.
All right, so if Porter is not the silver bullet, what are your recommendations, briefly?
The starting point of any business should be understanding of the context. When I say understanding of the context, I'm not only confining to understanding your customers. You need to understand your competitors, you need to understand your suppliers, you need to understand the regulatory regime, you need to understand everything about your context. And this understanding has to be at the executive level. It cannot be left to some consultants or some frontline people. The executive level they have to immerse themselves in the context in which they want to play. That is the first point. The second point is, based on this immersion, the executives have to figure out a way of creating products and services which are significantly better. There is no point tinkering around 2%, 3% improvement. You need to think about products which offer 3 times better service at half the price. And the third point is the whole philosophy which governs strategic development processes. And we need to open out companies, and hierarchy needs to give way to collaboration across the whole organization. And you need to invite frontline staff into strategic conversations. And you need to have more of these conversations rather than be confined to or dictated by the calendar. Those would be my kind of 3 critical recommendations.
Raj Raina, thank you.
Welcome. It's been a pleasure.